Mr. Carter had everything. A multi-millionaire businessman, owner of one of the biggest corporations in the city. His name was known everywhere. People admired him, respected him, and even feared him. He lived in a luxurious penthouse, drove the most expensive cars, and never had to check price tags. To outsiders, he was the definition of success, but deep inside something was missing. Every day he followed the same routine. Wake up in silk sheets, drink the finest coffee, attend endless meetings, sign million-dollar deals, and return home to a penthouse filled with expensive things, but no one to share them with. His schedule was full, yet his life felt empty. He never showed it, of course. In his world, emotions were a weakness. He had built his empire by being cold, calculated, and logical. Feelings had no place in business. That was how he survived. That was how he won. He had spent years focusing only on wealth, shutting out anything that didn't serve his success. Charity? A waste of money. Helping strangers? Not his problem. If people were struggling, they just needed to work harder. At least that's what he believed. Until one rainy evening. A night that would change everything. A moment that would break the walls he had spent years building. And it all started with a quiet sob on the sidewalk. It was a cold, rainy evening. Mr. Carter left his office late, stepping out onto the busy city streets. His driver was waiting by the curb, holding an umbrella over the sleek black car. The lights from the tall buildings reflected off the wet pavement, and people rushed past, eager to escape the rain. He adjusted his expensive coat and sighed. Another long day, another big deal closed. As he walked toward his car, something unusual caught his attention. A faint sound. A soft, broken sob. He turned his head slightly, scanning the sidewalk. At first he saw nothing but strangers walking by, too busy with their own lives. Then he spotted him. A small figure, curled up near the entrance of a closed shop. A boy, no older than 10, sat with his knees pulled to his chest. His clothes were soaked, his tiny hands trembling from the cold. His face was buried in his arms, and his body shook as he cried. Mr. Carter hesitated. He had passed by countless homeless people before. It was nothing new in the city. Normally he ignored them, just like everyone else. But this time felt different. For some reason, he couldn't look away. He stood there, frozen, watching the child. His driver opened the car door, waiting for him to step in. "Sir?" the driver asked. Mr. Carter didn't respond. His eyes stayed on the boy. People walked past the child like he was invisible. No one stopped. No one cared. The sobbing continued. The boy was alone, helpless, lost. A strange feeling stirred inside Mr. Carter, something he hadn't felt in years. Without thinking, he took a step forward, then another. Before he knew it, he was standing in front of the child. And for the first time in his life, he asked a question he had never cared to ask before. "What's wrong?" The boy flinched at the sound of the voice. Slowly, he lifted his head. His eyes were red and puffy from crying, his cheeks stained with dirt. His lips quivered as he looked up at the tall man in the expensive suit standing before him. Mr. Carter wasn't sure what to say next. He had never done this before. Talking to someone like this, someone so fragile. The boy wiped his nose with his sleeve but didn't answer. Mr. Carter tried again. "Why are you crying?" The boy hesitated, as if deciding whether to trust him. His voice was barely a whisper. "I'm hungry." Mr. Carter glanced at the people walking by. No one stopped, no one even looked at them. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a few bills. "Here, get something to eat." But to his surprise, the boy didn't take the money. Instead, he shook his head. "I don't want money." Mr. Carter frowned. He had expected the boy to grab the cash and run, like many others would. "Then what do you want?" he asked. The boy looked down at the ground. "Food, a warm place." Mr. Carter felt something strange in his chest, something unfamiliar. Why was he still standing here? He had done his part. He had offered help. The boy refused the money. That should be the end of it. And yet, he couldn't walk away. He studied the child, so small, so weak. He imagined him sleeping on the cold streets every night, ignored by the world. For the first time, Mr. Carter felt ashamed. Not of the boy, but of himself. He took a deep breath, adjusting his tie as if trying to shake off the unease inside him. Then, in a voice more certain than he expected, he said, "Come with me." The boy's eyes widened. "Where?" Mr. Carter didn't know the answer yet, but he knew one thing. Tonight, this child wouldn't sleep on the streets. Liam hesitated. He looked up at Mr. Carter, unsure if he had heard him right. Strangers never spoke to him, let alone offered help. "Come on," Mr. Carter said again, this time softer. Liam's stomach growled. The idea of a warm meal was too tempting to ignore. Slowly he got up, his small legs weak from exhaustion. Mr. Carter led him down the street to a small diner. It wasn't one of the fancy places he usually ate at, but it was warm, quiet, and open late. They walked inside. The smell of fresh food filled the air. Liam's eyes darted to the plates on people's tables, his mouth watering. A waitress walked over, looking at Liam with concern. "Is he with you?" she asked. Mr. Carter gave a short nod. "Yes, get him whatever he wants." Liam hesitated, gripping the edge of the table. "Anything?" "Anything." For the first time in a long time, Liam smiled. He ordered a simple meal, something warm, something filling, and when the food arrived, he didn't waste a second. He ate fast, too fast, like he was afraid someone would take it away. Mr. Carter watched in silence. He had eaten at the most expensive restaurants in the world, but he had never seen anyone enjoy a meal this much. For the first time in years, he felt something unexpected. Guilt. He had walked past children like Liam countless times. Had he ever once stopped? Had he ever once cared? As Liam ate, Mr. Carter spoke. "Where are your parents?" Liam's chewing slowed. He looked down at his plate. "My mom died last year." A pause. "And your dad?" Liam's voice became even quieter. "He left, said he couldn't take care of me." Something inside Mr. Carter twisted. A child, alone, abandoned. A life so different from his own. For years he thought money solved everything. But sitting here, watching a starving boy eat, he realized money wasn't the answer. For the first time in his life, he wanted to do more. And then a thought entered his mind. What if this wasn't just one meal? What if he changed this boy's life forever? Liam put his spoon down and let out a quiet sigh. His stomach was full for the first time in days. Mr. Brett Carter leaned back in his chair, studying the boy. He wasn't sure what had come over him tonight. He had never cared about anyone outside his world of business. Yet, something about Liam made it impossible to walk away. Liam wiped his mouth with his sleeve. "Thank you," he mumbled, barely meeting Mr. Carter's eyes. The words hit Mr. Carter harder than they should have. He had heard countless people thank him, business partners, employees, even investors, but this one felt different. Real. He checked his watch. It was late. The rain had stopped, but the cold air still lingered outside. Liam shifted in his seat, looking toward the door. It was clear he was thinking about where he would sleep. Mr. Carter sighed. "Where do you usually stay?" Liam shrugged. "Wherever I can." A pause. Mr. Carter tapped his fingers against the table. A part of him still resisted. This wasn't his problem. He wasn't a social worker. He wasn't a hero. And yet, he couldn't ignore the feeling in his chest. Without thinking too hard about it, he asked, "What if he stayed somewhere warm tonight?" Liam's head snapped up. His eyes filled with disbelief, locked onto Mr. Carter's. "What do you mean? I'll get you a hotel room. Just for tonight." Liam's mouth opened slightly, like he wanted to speak, but couldn't find the words. "You don't have to," he finally whispered. "I know." Silence stretched between them. Then, slowly, Liam gave a small nod. "Okay." Mr. Carter pulled out his phone and called his assistant, instructing them to book a nearby hotel. Liam didn't ask questions. Maybe he was too tired. Maybe he didn't want to ruin the moment. Minutes later they stepped outside. The cold air hit, but this time, Liam wasn't alone. As they walked to the car, Mr. Carter realized something. For the first time in years, he didn't feel empty. And for reasons he couldn't explain, he wasn't ready to let this boy go. The hotel room was simple, nothing compared to the luxury Mr. Carter was used to. But to Liam, it might as well have been a palace. As they entered, Liam hesitated at the door. His small hands clutched the straps of his worn-out backpack. "Go on," Mr. Carter said, nodding toward the bed. Liam stepped in carefully, almost like he was afraid someone would tell him it was a mistake. His fingers brushed over the soft blankets, testing them, feeling their warmth. He turned to Mr. Carter. "This is really for me?" "For tonight, yes." Liam's lips parted slightly, his eyes glassy with emotion. He nodded quickly, then climbed onto the bed, sinking into the comfort. Mr. Carter stood near the window, watching the city lights. His phone buzzed, work emails, missed calls that once felt urgent. But tonight, they didn't matter. He glanced back at Liam, who was now lying on the bed, staring at the ceiling. "Mr. Carter?" Liam's voice was quiet. "Yeah?" A pause. Why are you helping me? Mr. Carter didn't know the answer. Because I can, he finally said. Liam nodded as if that was enough. Maybe it was. Soon the boy's breathing slowed, his body relaxing for the first time in who knows how long. Within minutes he was asleep. Mr. Carter watched him for a moment. The boy looked peaceful, safe. And then a thought hit him. What happens tomorrow? Was he just going to drop Liam back on the streets after this? Pretend none of this happened? His chest tightened at the idea. He had built his entire life around making smart decisions. Every move calculated, every risk measured. But this was something else entirely. As he looked at Liam, he realized something. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like just a businessman. He felt like a human being. And maybe, just maybe, one night wasn't enough. Morning light streamed through the hotel window. Liam stirred, blinking as his eyes adjusted. For a brief moment he forgot where he was. The warmth, the softness, this wasn't the cold pavement or a damp alleyway. He sat up quickly, looking around. That's when he saw him. Mr. Carter was sitting in a chair, staring at his phone, but his expression was different. Not distant, not cold. He looked thoughtful. Liam hesitated. Are you leaving? Mr. Carter looked up. A pause. Then after a long breath, he said something even he didn't expect. No. Liam swallowed hard. He had learned not to trust good things. They never lasted. What happens now? Liam asked quietly. Mr. Carter leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. I don't know. But I do know one thing. I'm not putting you back on the streets. Liam's breath caught in his throat. You mean? Mr. Carter nodded. You're coming with me. Liam didn't speak. He couldn't. His whole life, no one had ever chosen him. No one had ever stayed. But this time, someone did. Days turned into weeks. Mr. Carter hired a lawyer, filed the paperwork, and made it official. Liam was no longer alone. At first, people around Mr. Carter were shocked. They whispered, speculated. Had he lost his mind? Why would a man like him do this? But for the first time in his life, he didn't care what people thought. Because for the first time, he wasn't just rich. He wasn't just powerful, he was something far greater. He was a father. And for the first time, his heart was full.